Welcome to this presentation. We're going to be talking a little bit about avoiding plagiarism. We're going to take a look here at some things in terms of the concept of plagiarism and a little bit about how you can avoid it and to work around it. So let's take a look here. First, let's talk a little bit about the definition of plagiarism. And I'm drawing this from the university catalog, and it's actually the same for undergraduates and graduates. And they define it as presenting words or ideas not your own as if they were your own. The technical definition here is 3 or more words taken directly from another author must be enclosed in quotation marks and footnoted. Now, I'll add a little commentary on that. It could be, although footnoting is one way of documenting, also in-text citation using either APA or MLA formatting are also acceptable ways. The source of distinctive ideas must be acknowledged, again, in a footnote or in a in-text citation. Words or ideas of another are not made your own by simple paraphrasing. We'll talk a little bit about the meaning of paraphrasing as we go here. Let me just say a few words about this as we go. Why is this? What is plagiarism then, and why is it important? Basically, I think one of the reasons why I think this is a significant topic for us as university students and those of us involved in university studies is that the basic work of what we do as academics, those of us who teach and work within the university environment, is really has centrally to do with sort of drawing on sources of others, commenting on them, developing the ideas, and sort of showing how we got those ideas, not just what did we do, but how did we get those ideas. And so from a real basic standpoint, good documentation and documenting where the source is from is kind of a key element to what we do as academics. And so knowing how to use appropriate documentation forms and how to incorporate outside voices into your own work is critical. The other part of it is, and this, I think this has to do with the mission of the university, is that we want to make sure as an instructor, I know for myself as an instructor, I want to make sure that the student, I'm actually trying to teach a student through the course. And one of the ways in which we can see what the student knows and has learned through the course is by what you turn in. And so when a source either partially or wholly is plagiarized, it's not your work, then we can't actually do our work of judging whether or not you've really mastered the material being asked. And for all of those reasons, the issue of plagiarism is something that's not just about a class, but also about the university education, which is why if you read further in Eastern's policies, some of the penalties for plagiarism can include both failure of an assignment, but also failure of a class. In some cases, even dismissal from the university. And a lot of it has to do with that, that when you're not using your own work or representing your own work appropriately, you're sort of shortcutting the educational process. And so for the university, we don't know if you're plagiarizing. We really don't know if we could guarantee by giving you a degree that you're doing the work, that you've mastered the work that we've expected. Okay. So a couple of questions you can ask to help avoid plagiarism. One is, am I using somebody else's words or ideas in my paper? When I do, have I given credit to the originator? And again, many, this is what you're going to find is that many, if not most, of the writings that you do as a college student are going to involve others' words or ideas. And this is one of the real basic things about college level writing that we're going to see is a little different from what you might have done more in high school, where sometimes you're going to be asked, what do you think about such and such, or tell me about some experience you've had, or reflect on this, where it's primarily your words or ideas. More typically, though, what's going to be happening in college level course is you're going to be asked to read something or read something from an outside source observe something from an outside source, and then reflect on that, and taking a new material and then reflect on it. So it will involve some of your opinion, but a lot of it is, what is this outside material saying? There are some exceptions. Sometimes you might read something in an outside source that we might call common knowledge, and that's, for example, like, say if you're studying the Civil War and you say, well, the Civil War began in 1861. Well, you might have read that in a source, but that is what we would consider common knowledge. It's not original to that particular source. So there are some exceptions to that. When you're quoting material, are you being exact? And we're going to talk a little bit about this. We're going to look at an example of an outside source, and you're going to want to make sure that when you are using the exact words of somebody else, that you are using quotation marks, and that you represent what's inside the quotation marks is exactly what appears in that outside source. And there are cases sometimes if you've made any changes within that quoted material, that you acknowledge it. We'll talk about that using brackets or ellipses to show additions or deletions. When paraphrasing material, have I used my own words and sentence structure? Have I represented the original meaning accurately? And so this is one of the things that's a little, I think, it's actually something that I imagine for a lot of college students and going into bachelor's and master's programs, sometimes this can be a challenge in that many times you're going to be asked or expected not necessarily to quote material, but to paraphrase. That is to say, take the meaning of another source and put it in your own words. What we find typically is that different disciplines take these things differently. My background is English literature. We tended to quote a lot. There's some reasons for that, because a lot of times the direct evidence that we have and what we're doing, the subject of analysis is usually words. They're, poems, novels, plays, that kind of thing. We quote all the time, and then we reflect on the quotes. In other disciplines, especially the sciences and social sciences, typically you might read a lot of articles and studies, but the words of those studies are not necessarily the important thing. It's the ideas the ideas of conclusions that the studies come up with, and so you're going to need to be paraphrasing. In this case, you want to make sure that you're using your own sentence structure, so that you're but nonetheless representing the original meaning accurately. Well, that's a tricky task, and one thing that again is a more advanced undergraduate and graduate student you want to be working on. Have I included all of the relevant information in each of my citations? Okay, so have you documented, then cited that source properly? Does my works cited or reference list include all of the sources that I've cited in the paper? So if you do cite, you have your either footnote or your in-text citation, do you then have a reference at the end, so that again, so the reader can actually find what it is that you said? And people do this, by the way. I know I do this as a reader. Sometimes I'm curious. I see a citation and I want to know. I want to look at the original. There's a variety of reasons. Maybe I want to know more, or maybe I want to just double check that the citation is accurate. I've been around academia long enough to know that that's not always true. That sometimes paraphrases are inaccurate, sometimes quotations are inaccurate, and I like to check those things. That's part of what being an academic is all about, kind of checking those kind of things. Okay. And so again, as I say that, I'm saying that as an academic. Your instructors probably feel the same way. Common knowledge, we talked a little bit about this before. Sometimes there's basic information that anybody would know in a specific field of study. This is folklore, common sense observation. Just because you need to look something up in a reference book does not mean it's not common knowledge. Now, having said this, again, one thing you're going to find, especially as you're maybe a first or second year student or new in a field, you might not know what the common knowledge in the field is yet. And so there's nothing wrong there's nothing wrong with citing something, even if it's common knowledge. In other words, you're sort of, as you're learning what is novel information, what's common knowledge in a particular field. Facts. Charlemagne ruled Rome from 800 to 814. People New Orleans celebrate Mardi Gras before Lent. These are some examples here of logical assumptions or observations, fairy tales, kind of common knowledge. Here's some of our basic terms. Quotation uses the exact words of an original source and is indicated by the use of quotation marks around the material to be quoted, along with an appropriate citation. That could be a footnote, which is again mostly used for those of you who are writing in history or in biblical studies, particularly biblical theological studies often use that. The rest of us probably are using an in-text citation format in which the citation really consists of either a signal phrase at the beginning according to, and then the person's last name, like according to Jones, and then page numbers at the end, and if it's APA style, including the year of publication. That functions as a signal phrase, and then along with the reference at the end, the full reference. So that's quotation. And again, we want to make sure when we have exact words or phrases from a text, we want to make sure that we're using quotation marks around it. 3 or more words is the rule that the University Catalog gives us. A summary is a brief account of material from the original and should include appropriate citation. And the ideas of the summary should reflect the original source, but the words need to be different from the original. Oftentimes, again, a lot of times if you're writing in the sciences or social sciences, you might very well provide a summary of the conclusions of a source. A lot of, you might read an article and you might want to, a lot of times your main task would be to actually summarize the conclusions. What did these authors did a study, what did they find? And so that would be a typical example of a summary in which you're focusing on really the main idea of that. Sometimes you might focus on some of the internal elements like their methodology or that kind of thing. But a lot of times it's really the main idea, okay? Now paraphrase is similar to summary, but it's really kind of taking maybe a sentence or a phrase and kind of rephrasing it into your own words. So for example, you might, maybe you're doing a class in New Testament and you cite, the Bible says, Jesus said, do unto others as you would have done unto you, okay? So the golden rule. You might paraphrase, you might say, in other words, treat others as you'd like to be treated. Okay, that's an example. So now I'm taking the idea from the original source, but now I'm putting it kind of in my own words, or the words that sound more kind of how people might talk today. Okay. But, and this is the key thing, whether it's a summary or paraphrase or quotation, you need to cite. Okay, so in other words, just because you put it in your own words doesn't mean it's your idea. Okay, it's really, it's just your way of expressing that. It's your arrangement of the words. Okay. Now I'm going to go over a couple of strategies. How can you avoid plagiarism while paraphrasing? It's easy. With quotation, it's pretty easy, and that's I think one of the things I like in my field, English, is that it's like you quote, and then you can kind of you know what the source is and kind of how you reflect it. But in a lot of fields, you're going to be relying more on paraphrasing. So here's what I would suggest. Write down the quotations. If you have a specific idea, you can write down that quotation to be utilized. Okay. And then review that, and then cover it over, turn it, maybe have a card, a lot of people like that using, quotation, put them on a little note card, turn it over. And now try writing out a summary or paraphrase without looking at the original, or maybe talking it over with a friend or roommate. Then once you've done that, then maybe you can turn that back over and you can compare your summary or paraphrase with the original and make adjustments where necessary when the language is too similar. And then finally, make sure to cite the paraphrase or summary using the appropriate documentation format. Again, MLA, at Eastern, it's typically going to be MLA or APA and occasionally Chicago style. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at this is a classic example of, for citation principles. Is we're going to see a little quote here, and then we're going to take a look at some sample summary, paraphrase, or quotations and see which ones work and which ones don't. And you're going to see they're going to work or not work for different reasons. Okay, so here's this quotation. The character and mentality of the keepers may be of more importance in understanding prisons than the character and mentality of the kept. Okay, now we'll take a look here. We're going to look at examples here of quotation. We see here paraphrasing. It would be more beneficial to observe the character mentality of the prisoner, prison keepers than their prisoners. And then we have the second one. One analyst maintains that we may be able to learn more about prisons from the psychological state of the prison officials than that of the prisoners. Now, here's two examples. As you can see, the first is really, they're both attempts at paraphrase, but notice the first one is a little bit, I think it's a little bit too similar to especially the mentality, character and mentality of the keepers. So we would probably go, the second one gives us a little bit more original language that would reflect appropriate paraphrase. Now here we're going to look at another example. And this one again, you see here we have a quotation from Beyond, Adaptation to Life. And you can see, I'll read the quotation here, and then we'll take a look at some example, some attempts at citation. We'll talk a little bit about what works and what doesn't. Okay, I would agree with the sociologist that psychological labeling is dangerous. Society can inflict terrible wounds by discrimination and by confusing health with disease, and disease with badness. Okay, so here is a quotation. We're going to look at some examples here now. Number one, here we have an attempt at paraphrase. So trying to put it into your own language. And you notice here, and I think in terms of citation issues, one of the things I would say is what we're getting at here are really, there's some subtleties here. So I want to acknowledge that, then, that this first example is it is an attempt at paraphrase, and we can see that by the fact that they've cited this source in this case it's really MLA style. So they put, according to George Vaillant, that signal phrase, which signals to the reader that what is coming up is going to be either quotation or, in this case, paraphrase or summary. Now, but when we look at it, we'll notice some of the language here, inflicting wounds, psychiatric language, labeling, confusing health, disease, and badness, very, very similar to the original. So in this case, this would be kind of a good example of inadequate paraphrasing that we'd want to change. If you're paraphrasing it, use your language to do the paraphrase. Now, the second one here is an example of quotation. So again, you see also has that, according to Vaillant, so you see it's formatted basically the same way with that introductory signal phrase, which tells me that what's coming up is now going to be a quotation. I can see that by the quotation. So just a couple of words about, so here we have what looks to be an adequate quotation. Now you'll notice here that it does change some things, and we'll talk a little bit about this. You can see you have two ways of making adjustments to text here. One is the brackets. You can see here, e.g. schizophrenic. So that's not in the original. But the brackets tell us that. They tell us that something is being changed, but when a writer does this, it comes because the text might use a pronoun like he or she, let's say, or they, and it's not clear. The noun might have appeared earlier in the text, and you want to make sure that noun is there. So and that's okay to replace it. If this say they and you want to see the name of the company or whatever, that's fine, but you put it in brackets because it is a change to the text. Now, in this case, they've just really added information, what kind, they're being specific about what kind of labeling, but they put it in brackets anyway. Okay, so that's one way of changing. Now, the other way, the other change here is this use of the ellipses, that ... And that is something that sometimes writers will do as a way of indicating that they've truncated the text, that they've taken out something. And sometimes you'll find this, it's really that maybe the writer goes on a tangent, at least from your perspective, or into something that isn't necessarily relevant to what you're talking about. So you can do that. You can acknowledge it, that you've taken out words using ellipses. As a good scholar, you don't want to take out words that are, or phrases that would change the meaning of the text. You're going to do that because maybe there's additional information that's involved. Okay. Third one here, according to this is another example of inadequate paraphrase, that health and disease and badness. is kind of, again, we want it, that's the language of the original. So it's a paraphrase, but it's inadequate. Here we have an example. Psychiatric labels can badly hurt those labeled because they fail to distinguish among health, illness, and immorality. This is a reasonable paraphrase, I think. It's again containing the meaning of the original, but it doesn't, it uses a different language there. The next one here, number 5. This is one I would call without the citation here. It's really in effect, it is a plagiarized example here because it's taking what we know to be Velant as a source and simply putting it into your own words. So you would still need to cite this, with that according to Velant. So. And then the final one here, we have an example where you can see, okay, this one is cited, and this is using a parenthetical citation. So it's adequately cited, but then when you look at the quotation, you'll notice that it's not exactly accurate. It's close, but it's not. It's a little bit different, and it has the writer has not acknowledged that. So those are a couple of things that you would want to look for in terms of citation. One of the things that you can see here, doing citation accurately, it does take some time and some effort to make sure that they're adequately working through the material and citing appropriately. So I think so you can see, I hope as you're working through that boy, it would be helpful to start, the earlier you start, if you know you have a research project, a citation, especially if you're new into a particular field, the easier it's going to go for you. And of course, if you have questions, some of these things, as you can see, is this adequate? Is this adequate paraphrase? Is the summary accurate? Those kind of things. Again, the earlier you do things, those are great things also to bring up to your instructor. I'm trying to make sure that I'm citing this correctly. Could you take a look at this before I submit it? That would be another thing to look at. One of the things I'll recommend, and I won't have time, it takes a long time for this to load up, but just so you can see, you actually have, if you're working Google Docs for your papers, I think it was about last winter, the university was able to add a feature that will allow you to do some additional checking of your work before you submit it. And I know many of you probably know this, that a lot of your instructors might, when you submit things through Brightspace, they might run it through this thing called Turnitin. It's a similarity checker. As it turns out now, if you're concerned about that, maybe you've been working through a paper and you think, I've been working with these sources, I want to make sure that I can double check things before I've submitted. What you can do if you're using your Eastern Google account, which means you're entering through your Eastern email and going to Google Docs. There is a checker you can do, and so this is an article that I published a few years ago. But what you do is, first of all, you make sure you upload it. You have to make sure that it is a Google Doc. If you upload it from like Word, you can just go, and I think what you do is you go save as Google Docs, like that. So in other words, you're saving it into the system. Okay, so do that, and then what you can do is you go under extensions here, and you go down to what's called Turnitin Draft Coach, and you hit that. And it actually has a couple of things that you can do. One of which is actually I know I talked about making sure you have your citations present both in the text, but then in the references. There's a system that can help you to identify missing citations. Maybe you cite something but in the text, but did you include the reference? There is another function that will do some grammar assistance for you. But then the one that would be relevant for you now is what we call the similarity check. Again, it takes a little bit. I'm not going to run it now here, but you can do this. And what it will do, you just hit a button. It will do a check, and it'll basically be it's basically what the instructors would see when if they do this. And you're given up to 3 checks per paper. So there's a limit there. for a particular paper. And what it'll do, it'll kind of, when you see it, it's, you have to, you will see, it will kind of flag things, like there will be, it'll highlight portions of text that are similar to what, where you have phrases or sentences that come, that are identical to another source, and usually will identify that source. And so you have to take a look at this. It's a couple of things to mention. One is that you're probably going, if you're doing a research project and you have quotations, those quotations will likely show up. If it's a sort, if it's a printed source, often, then a magazine article or journal article, then it'll probably appear highlighted. So that doesn't, just because it shows up doesn't, as long as you quoted it, then that is okay. You'll also probably see sometimes kind of innocuous words and phrases will appear, like maybe you say something in the final analysis. Well, that's a kind of a cliche opening for a sentence. Well, that might appear, and sometimes you see that kind of thing. But again, this is a tool that you could use to be able to kind of maybe feel a little more confident that if you've gone through the steps to be able to do that. Okay. The other thing that I will mention here is please go ahead and visit the Writing Center. If you go onto the Eastern website and you type in Writing Center in the search, you will find our page. And we have ways for students to sign up for appointments as traditional undergraduates through our WC Online system with in-person and online appointments. And we also have our writing assistant for graduate and non-traditional students, who also has, does live as well as asynchronous appointments.